They called it the War Between States, a conflict born of principle, power, and politics. But away from the gunfire and the cries of the battlefield, some parts of the Civil War were fought in the shadows by men who abandoned all the rules. Among these lurking figures was a man who stood apart, a captain in the Confederate Army, though it wasn't any clever strategies or inspiring leadership that history remembers him for. It was his brutality. Even in a war infamous for its savagery, his name became synonymous with terror. Union officers and even his Confederate allies struggled to understand him, and civilians lived in fear of the day they set eyes on his ragged banner. Although he held the rank of captain, he did not lead an army detachment. He led a gang of partisan raiders, a gang that left behind scorched towns, mutilated bodies, and tales so grotesque even hardened veterans found them hard to believe. So, who was this man, and how did he come to be known as one of the most depraved figures of the Civil War? William T. Anderson was born in Hopkins County, Kentucky in 1840. He was one of 6 children. Although the Anderson family was not well off, they were well respected in their local community. William and his siblings went to school, where they received an average mid-1800s education. They learned about Christian teachings, American history, and the supposed natural order of things. White people are at the top, and everything else was below. It was not surprising, therefore, that the Andersons supported slavery, though they themselves were not rich enough to own any enslaved people. When William was 17, the family moved to Kansas. At the time, Kansas was in the midst of a conflict over whether it should be a slave or free state. Many activists from both sides moved there to try to turn the tide of the conflict. While in Kansas, the Anderson family became friendly with several high-profile Confederates, and their fortunes blossomed. By the time he was 20, William's family owned a large property and had a net worth of around $38,000 in today's money. But things started to go downhill. William's mother died suddenly, and his brother went on the run after he killed a Native American. William started getting into trouble too. He shot and killed a member of the Kaw tribe, claiming that the man had tried to rob him. Although he was not convicted of a crime, this incident marks the beginning of a string of brutal murders committed by William T. Anderson. Perhaps in an effort to tame his wild son, William's father brought William to work with him. William was given a managerial position, but it didn't last long. William soon left the company and began horse trading back in Kansas. At first, he was operating within the confines of the law, but after the Civil War began in 1861, it became easier than ever to steal horses and resell them across state lines. William, his brother Jim, and their friend Lee Griffith worked together, sometimes selling stolen horses as far away as New Mexico. By this time, William Anderson's descent into lawlessness was well underway, but things were about to take a more disturbing turn. In early 1862, Anderson and his brother were caught stealing horses in Missouri and narrowly escaped capture. Lee Griffith, however, was not so lucky. He spent 4 months in prison and was only released because he swore loyalty to the Union. Returning to Kansas in the spring, Anderson, his brother, and Griffith continued horse trafficking, but they were soon found out. In May 1862, a judge issued an arrest warrant for Griffith, who went into hiding. The Anderson family was suspected of helping him hide. William and Jim's father was angered by the accusations, so he confronted the judge with a gun, but in the altercation was fatally shot. In revenge for their father's death, the Anderson brothers locked the judge in the council building and set it on fire, killing him. It was around the time of this incident that the Civil War escalated. The borderlands between Kansas and Missouri dissolved into utter chaos. Unlike the battles that took place in other parts of the United States, the conflict in this region did not unfold through conventional military engagements. Instead, it was a vicious and deeply personal struggle, driven by over a decade of disagreements over whether or not Kansas would allow slavery. When war finally broke out, this long-standing fight became much more brutal. Regular armies struggled to maintain control, especially in isolated rural regions. In the power vacuum, irregular militias sprung up. They were groups of local men, often with personal grudges, who took up arms under the banner of either the Union or the Confederacy, but were rarely governed by formal chains of command. On the Union side, there were groups like the Kansas Jayhawkers, guerrilla bands who raided pro-slavery towns, looted property, and executed suspected Confederate sympathizers. On the Confederate side were the bushwhackers. These were small mobile bands of fighters who launched ambushes and hit-and-run attacks against Union troops and civilians alike. These were not soldiers operating under military discipline. They were raiders, saboteurs, and vigilantes. And the war they waged was not one of territory or strategy. It was a war of revenge. Entire families were implicated based on rumor, political allegiance, or past associations. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Homes were burned to the ground, and innocent civilians were often caught in the crossfire, and sometimes deliberately targeted. It was in this violent, lawless environment that William "Bloody Bill" Anderson emerged. With a taste for risk, a growing bitterness after his father's death, and several victims' blood already on his hands, he found himself perfectly suited to this shadow war. For men like Anderson, who might have simply been petty criminals in peacetime, the chaos of the borderlands offered a kind of legitimacy, or at least a cover for their crimes. The Kansas-Missouri border became less a battleground and more a crucible, forging some of the most brutal and remorseless figures of the entire war. William Anderson was not the first to take up arms in this chaotic no-man's land, but he would become one of the most infamous. Putting aside his horse-stealing activities, he began riding with a loose collection of Confederate bushwhackers. Among their ranks was the notorious William Quantrill, the leader of this guerrilla band who led raids and ambushes throughout Missouri. Under Quantrill's command, Anderson found both comradeship and purpose, though not the kind that would redeem him. Quite the opposite. Anderson quickly gained a reputation for his savagery, even among men who already operated outside the accepted rules of warfare. Where others might kill to achieve a strategic end, Anderson seemed to relish in the act itself. When captured Union soldiers fell into his hands, few survived, and their deaths were never quick nor clean. Anderson liked to make a spectacle of his victims. Some were scalped while they were still alive, and others had their bodies mutilated and left as gruesome displays to warn others. Some accounts even claimed that Anderson took trophies from those he killed, and that he decorated his horse's bridle with them. And it wasn't just Union soldiers who suffered. Civilians also became his victims, particularly if they were suspected of having Union sympathies. In some cases, men accused of aiding the enemy were dragged from their beds and executed in front of their wives and children. Although he had already killed the judge who shot his father, and was responsible for the deaths of several more men he had been involved in skirmishes with, it wasn't until 1863 that Anderson became the depraved figure that history remembers. In August of that year, Union forces arrested several women suspected of being Confederate sympathizers. Among them were Anderson's two sisters. They were imprisoned in a makeshift jail in Kansas City. While they were confined there, the building collapsed on top of them. One of Anderson's sisters was killed, and the other was injured. Afterwards, rumors started to circulate that the buildings had been intentionally damaged by Union soldiers, and Anderson became convinced that his sisters had been deliberately killed. It was in the aftermath that Anderson's motivations changed. He was no longer just a wild young man with a violent streak. He was now a vicious killer who enjoyed taking lives. Fueled by the desire for retribution, Anderson and the other bushwhackers under Quantrill's command decided to attack the Union territory of Lawrence, Kansas. Anderson, now with the rank of lieutenant, was given command of 40 men, and when they arrived in Lawrence, they immediately began killing almost every man they came across. Anderson killed 14 people on that day, a day that would come to be remembered as the Lawrence Massacre. By 1864, Anderson had murdered dozens more. Even among the lawless bushwhackers, he was considered frightening. However, there were some in Quantrill's gang who were ready to follow him to hell and back. After a dispute with Quantrill, Anderson broke with the bushwhackers and formed his own gang of followers. Tensions between the two vigilante groups escalated, and in the spring of 1864, one of Anderson's men was accused of stealing from someone under Quantrill's command. He was shot and killed. Anderson, rather than confront Quantrill over the man's death, went to a Confederate general with the news that Quantrill had killed an officer of the Confederate Army. In the wake of Anderson's betrayal, Quantrill was taken into custody, and Anderson was promoted from lieutenant to captain. From then on, Anderson became known as Bloody Bill, and he and his gang of guerrillas embarked on a campaign of unrelenting terror. The most infamous of all would come in the late summer of 1864. It was September 27th, and Bloody Bill Anderson rode with a force of 75 men to the town of Centralia. There, they looted every building they came across and robbed hundreds of civilians. While they searched the town for valuables, they discovered several barrels of whiskey and began drinking. Fueled by alcohol, the robbing devolved into something much more sinister. When a train approached on the railroad just outside Centralia, Anderson's men blocked its path and forced it to stop. Opening the doors, they discovered 23 off-duty Union soldiers inside. Many of them were young recruits on leave. They were unarmed. What followed was one of the most brutal events in the history of the Civil War. Anderson and his men held the passengers at gunpoint, stealing their valuables and forcing the Union soldiers to strip out of their uniforms. He then ordered the soldiers to line up and announced that he was going to execute them. Only one soldier was kept alive for a prisoner exchange. The rest were gunned down in cold blood, while the other train passengers watched in horror. Afterwards, when Union forces attempted to track him down, Anderson lured them into an ambush. More than 100 were killed in the ensuing slaughter, and many survivors were tortured. The bodies of the dead were mutilated and displayed as warnings to other Unionists. Perhaps most disturbingly, Anderson did not try to conceal these acts. On the contrary, he boasted of his brutality to other guerrillas, many of whom were disturbed by what he told them. By this point, Union forces had issued standing orders to pursue and kill Anderson on sight, considering him beyond legitimate warfare. Even Confederate commanders, initially willing to tolerate guerrilla fighters, began to view Anderson as a liability. His actions were so extreme that they undermined the Southern cause, turning public sentiment against the guerrilla war effort. But by then, Anderson didn't care. He had slipped beyond politics, beyond command structures, and arguably beyond sanity. In addition to the violent killings, tortures, and mutilations, Anderson began breaking into the homes of prominent Union leaders and violating their black servants. Finally, the Union had reached breaking point over Bloody Bill. They dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Samuel P. Cox to hunt him down and put an end to his reign of terror. On October 26, 1864, Cox tracked down Anderson's gang of guerrillas, and a battle broke out. Anderson was killed when he took a bullet to the head, and in a gruesome twist of irony, his body was treated like one of his own victims. His corpse was posed for photos and paraded through the streets by the Union soldiers. Today, even after over 100 years since his death, William Anderson is remembered as one of the most evil, depraved men of the Civil War. Many historians class him as a clear example of how war changes people, turning them against each other, creating monsters.